Hello and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls 2 Dissected. Today I have another video uncovering invisible walls. Join me as we explore Drangleic with the collisions toggled on to get a clear look at how the environment is actually constructed, and this should help us discover a few oddities along the way. Now, before we begin our level by level tour, I should start by explaining the different collisions in the game and how they work. If you already watched my video on the invisible walls of Dark Souls 1, a good chunk of this will be familiar, so feel free to jump to the timestamp on the screen if this is redundant for you. These games use two different kinds of environmental collisions. There's low collision and high collision. In debug for Dark Souls 2, low collisions can be toggled to display as blue, and high collisions get this sort of orange or amber color. Low collision has a lower polygon count and will simplify shapes in the environment, while high collision has a higher polygon count and tends to match what we see more accurately. If you want to get deeper into the weeds of collision types, these would also be known as simple and complex collisions. I can link to some resources on that in the video description, but understandably it's very helpful to have a simpler form of collision that's less demanding on the game for certain tasks, and a more complex form of collision that might require more effort for the game to think about and interact with, but nonetheless there are times where you need aspects of the environment to not just be really simplified shapes. What does this mean for Dark Souls? Well, low collisions are used to keep the player in the environment. It's the thing you interact with when walking around. It's what makes you not fall through floors and unable to walk through walls. The player character has different collision types as well. There's more accurate ones for determining if enemy attacks hit you, but what we use to navigate the environment is this much larger capsule. If this capsule can't fit through a given space of low collisions or object collisions, that's what holds you back. While the creation of low collisions are typically automated in some way, as there aren't developers drawing lower poly versions of the entire level by hand, hands-on adjustments often come in the form of invisible walls. Spots where the low collisions aren't just a low poly reconstruction of the space around you, but rather something extra added to obstruct your movements. They're here to try and prevent you from getting out of bounds, getting stuck in weird corners, or maybe prevent unintended shortcuts and all of the issues those might cause. Low collisions are also used for determining if you can lock onto an enemy, in addition to other parameters like distance. Here I should be close enough to this enemy to be able to lock onto it, however it doesn't work until I angle the camera down a little. This is because there's a taller invisible wall here, and locking on isn't possible unless our camera has a clear view of the lock-on reticule point. This explains every time in a Souls game where you might have tried locking onto an enemy through something like a window, but it didn't work. That window was probably completely enclosed with an invisible wall, which had the unfortunate side effect of breaking your ability to lock on. Though you might have still been able to attack through the window, and this is where high collisions come in. High collisions serve two primary purposes. They're used to determine if player attacks collide with the environment or not. So for something like a window that doesn't allow you to lock on through it, just because it's covered with an invisible wall, that doesn't necessarily prevent attacking through it if the high collisions are accurate and open up for the window space. But bear in mind that while high collisions are overall more accurate to what you see in the environment, they're not always one-to-one with the visual geometry either. Sometimes something like a set of bars might be a completely solid sheet of high collision that won't allow you to shoot arrows between them. Sometimes they do this, sometimes they don't, it just depends. High collisions are also used for inverse kinematics. This is a system used to pose the skeleton of your character based on the things they're standing on. The game will recognize what your foot should be standing on, and then it'll bend your legs accordingly. This is how staircases fundamentally work, and why we can see our feet clearly planted on two different steps. The actual collision that you interact with will be a smooth ramp for your capsule to glide up. Any inclines that are too sudden might get us stuck, so jagged steps and low collisions would be bad, and that's why they're avoided. But high collisions can have sudden leaps to them, being shaped like actual stairs. Because even though it's not the thing we're actually walking on top of, whenever our feet are near high collision, they get pulled towards it. You can think of it as a superficial visual adjustment to our character. While inverse kinematics and blocking our attacks make up the bulk of what high collisions are used for, various parameters in the data can tell specific pieces of collisions to have certain properties. So it does have other uses as well. What people often refer to as a kill box for falling off of cliffs is just a sheet of high collision that kills the player when they pass through it. And it can be used for things like area transitions, and even invisible walls that only work for certain enemies rather than the player. The Dark Souls 1 debug was more specialized to include different colors for all of these sub-uses, so it was a lot easier in my previous video to spot things like death planes as being something different from the rest of the environment. Sadly, that isn't the case for Dark Souls 2, all high collisions will be the same amber color. And lastly, I should mention object collision. This is something completely separate from the normal high and low collisions of the surrounding environment. Objects need to have the ability to be dynamic, as sometimes they're breakable or movable. Since environmental collisions can't be dynamic in the same way, anytime you're on something like a moving elevator or rotating bridge, what you interact with is part of the object file itself. And this does get its own color in debug, thankfully, which is a light green. Now, something to bear in mind before we start exploring each area to see what we can find, I should also quickly talk about the concept of getting out of bounds. One of the things I try to look out for in an Invisible Walls video is to see what worked and what didn't. Sometimes they leave out invisible walls where they probably shouldn't have, allowing you to get out of bounds. However, in the case of Dark Souls 2, we can't really judge the implementation of invisible walls based on whether or not they entirely prevented getting out of bounds, because there are some pretty wild glitches in this game. There are glitches that allow you to basically fly, there are glitches that let you use ladders in extremely cursed ways, and there's even a glitch for being able to jump much further with the Moon Butterfly set than you're normally supposed to. When you do stuff like that, the game is pretty much broken wide open at that point. Being able to get out of bounds with those methods is primarily an issue with the existence of these glitches themselves, and in my opinion, not really a flaw or shortcoming of the collisions. So I'm not particularly interested in just anywhere you can get out of bounds. There's far too many places to mention. I'm more interested in all the places where you can still get out of bounds without using glitches. Anywhere a normal jump can lead to shenanigans is a lot more relevant to what we'll be looking at, so discussions about being able to get out of bounds will be mostly limited to glitchless exploration. Okay, so with all of the introductions finally out of the way, let's get started. There's not anything too special happening in things betwixt, but we can start off by seeing how precarious obstacles in the environment are typically protected with a much larger invisible wall. It's better safe than sorry. You don't want the player getting stuck anywhere weird, so something like a log or branch or a set of rocks might have a much simpler wall blocking the entire area. This type of design is pretty standard, and what we should expect to find in most places that are similar to this. But for something a little unexpected here, we do find our first enemy wall in things betwixt. This is one of those special uses of high collisions I mentioned in the intro. This particular sheet here was given a special property that blocks certain enemies. You can see that they didn't want enemies to try and follow you outside the level, since this is right by the level's exit. Though it is a bit redundant in its implementation, as nearby enemies also have leash points in their AI that won't allow them to chase you this far in the first place. The only way that I can see that an invisible enemy wall is really here, and that's not just some other kind of transition plane, is by taking control of a basilisk and moving it myself. Trying to walk through here reveals that enemies can't pass through it. Still, it doesn't hurt to have some redundancy, and it's really not too surprising from a design standpoint. Whoever is tasked with putting the environment together isn't always going to know what the AI of nearby enemies is capable of, so putting something like this between the boundaries of different areas isn't uncommon. In Majula, things start to get a bit more interesting. Displaying the collisions reveals an overabundance of caution. Some of the walls between different sections of the level get these really tall walls extending above them, as do some of the rocks. I like this rock in particular here, which has a tall cone extending above it, ensuring that you'd slip off of it if you somehow got on top. They really just didn't want you climbing on top of anything, trying to avoid anything from turning into a stepping stool for getting out of bounds. I like how there's this one rock by the cliffside that was given a cone that wasn't steep enough to slide off of, though. This means you can jump on top of it to see yourself float in the air. In my video for the invisible walls of Dark Souls 1, I encouraged players to leave messages saying illusory wall in these kinds of spots, but something interesting happened here. The message I tried to place teleported back to the ground I was last standing on, and if I were to quit and reload, I would teleport back down from the rock as well. So weird spots like this were at least designated to be some sort of unstable ground. Like, the game knows this isn't right, in a way that Dark Souls 1 wouldn't have. So that's an interesting technical improvement. Anyways, going online revealed that other players were messing around here too, thanks to their bloodstains. We'll also find some taller walls along the path leading towards these shaded woods. And another wall protects all the stuff in Malin's shop. I thought it was also interesting to see how they experimented with the tents, as there's no real consistency on how they're implemented throughout the game. In Majula, they made the tents as object files with their own collision, seen in green here. But they also surrounded them with flat invisible walls, really not wanting you to try climbing them. Maybe the object's collision alone wasn't enough to prevent some weirdness? But the ones in Tseldora didn't bother with any of that. Here they didn't make any of them as objects and only used low collision instead. But they also didn't bother surrounding them with those tall invisible walls, having the collision match the shapes of the tents instead. I spotted this one tent by the bonfire where they did put a small flat wall near the bottom. The obvious intent was to try and stop you from climbing it, but then you can see how they didn't even do this for the rest of them. They stopped trying to protect them at this point, and the worst outcome I can find is being able to awkwardly climb them just a little bit. So basically we have a descending progression of protection that they put on their tents, and it's difficult to say if any of it was necessary. And for a quick tangent here that doesn't really have anything to do with invisible walls, but I wanted to point out where the collisions might provide some insight on the development process. I could be drawing the wrong conclusions from what I'm seeing here, and it might just be a completely random accident, but I do think I spotted a loose end from when the developers were trying to optimize performance. In the Majula mansion, we find this chest and this cabinet. These are object files. We can turn on the object collision to display to see what in this room is actually an object and what isn't. While we did see some redundancy on the tents outside, where they doubled up having both object collision and low environmental collision, these are the exceptions and very much not the norm throughout the game. Look at any given object. If you see something turn green, you can assume it only has object collision and that there isn't going to be any high or low collision also covering it. But that's not the case with these objects here. They both have high collisions and not any low collisions for some reason, which serves no purpose at all if you think about it. Bearing in mind that we would need low collision and not high collision to not walk through a given space, that means the object's collisions are already serving their purpose. The objects themselves already stop us from walking through them. Since high collisions stop player attacks, you might be thinking that maybe it was a way to protect these objects, but that's not the case either, as our attacks still make contact with the object inside. They were just made to be indestructible anyways. The only thing I can guess is that we're looking at an unfinished process of optimization. We can find the same chest and cabinet in other parts of the game, like the Iron Keep, things Betwixt, and even elsewhere in Majula. But when we find them in these other places, they're no longer object files at all. They were instead baked into the map itself, where then having only high and low collisions and no object collision at all makes sense. Having a lot of objects can hurt the game's performance, so if they didn't care about making them destructible, it's not surprising to find some things that originated as objects but aren't any longer, where they became part of the map itself, same as any surrounding wall or floor. What we find in Majula looks to me like a couple of objects that simply failed to complete that conversion process. In talking about this with some friends, Moonlight Ruin pointed out that there's essentially some non-existent objects in Mullen's shop that are overlaid with this map piece, so that's probably more evidence of objects having gone through the process of being replaced. Speaking of unfinished things, we also have this rock with some weird collisions. It's not surprising to see a bigger box of low collision surrounding it, that's normal for low collision, but since high collision should usually match what we see, it's odd to find it outlining what appears to be a bigger rock, with a couple smaller non-existent rocks on top of it. This isn't a very common mistake to find in the high collisions, but consider it foreshadowing for now for some weird stuff we'll find later. Because high collisions are used for inverse kinematics, this means that jumping on top of this rock can make your legs interact with some invisible stuff in a way that looks funny. Okay, onto the Forest of Fallen Giants. Dead-end caves that we're not supposed to be able to get into are unsurprisingly completely covered with invisible walls. In addition to one at the beginning of the level, we also find this by Kale the Cartographer's Cave, and another blocking this out-of-bounds area near the Soldier's Rest bonfire. The railing on this tower has some invisible railing protection as well. If you've seen my Dark Souls 1 video, you'll already be aware that this can be a pretty common thing on descending staircases, because the height provided by jumping down a set of stairs is always an opportunity to get on top of or over its railing. For here in particular, they didn't want you trying to get to this out-of-bounds landmass, which would end poorly for the player as it lacks any collision to stand on, plus as a kill plane hiding just underneath it anyways. On this upper ledge, they also put much taller walls surrounding it, basically doubling the height of what you see, or even more in some spots. And at the end of this platform, they put walls that are more severe than the visible rubble. This was of course all in service of making it so that you wouldn't be able to climb the rubble and be able to jump up onto the broken walls. If we were able to, then we'd be able to get onto the far side of this bridge, somewhere we're not meant to be. But we can still get back there anyways. Let's take a look from the opposite side. We can see how they put up a wall that tries to stop you from getting back there. On the left side, this invisible wall extends to and covers the railing, but on the right side, it doesn't. It was left wide open. So now it's a question if we can get on top of this, and we can. This jump is a lot easier if you get the Moon Butterfly set, but it's still possible even without it. But something funny happens along the way. It looks like we shouldn't make it, and that we should probably roll off the edge, but you can wind up floating in mid-air. This is because, for whatever reason, the collision of the column below just happens to extend all the way up here, creating a wider platform for us to land on. Once we get back here, despite being out of bounds, the entire surface of this area is still covered in collision, aside from the rubble and the railing on the left side. This means you're free to just drop off wherever you want. In some spots you might wind up getting stuck somewhere out of bounds, but you can very easily stay in bounds and use it as a shortcut to the Soldier's Rest bonfire. I don't think this is useful in any speedrunning routes, but nonetheless it's a fun thing you can do, caused by simply failing to protect both sides of the rubble pile the same way. This is a skip that I found on my own when looking at this stuff, but unsurprisingly others already knew about it, and I'll link to a video by Phobia that shows a much easier way of doing the jump with Moon Butterfly gear. Anyways, while we're down by the Soldier's Rest bonfire, there's a couple things we can look at. The low collision for this rubble pile goes higher than what we can see, and we are able to get on top of it without glitches. So it's just kind of a funny spot to stand and float on. More importantly, the high collision here is pretty inaccurate and taller than it should be. This can result in your projectiles impacting against what looks like nothing, which can be a little frustrating. I also appreciate how the little drop back down to the entrance of this area is a little bit more open than it looks, with the collision ramping down to a point that makes it not as tall or as severe of an obstacle as it appears. So you can take a small shortcut here if you really wanted to. It's also much safer than I previously realized. I always assumed you had to aim for the cliff's edge a bit more, where the jump isn't as high, but you can hold to the left while doing it and you won't risk falling into the pit at all. Back up where we left off before heading out of bounds, I also wanted to point out how the railings are a little taller than they appear, and the rubble piles don't have any smooth inclines at all, as those are also covered with some pretty tall, flat walls. This was to help make sure you couldn't climb this stuff for a shortcut to this area behind the King's Gate. Not that there's anything useful over there early on in the game, but I suppose that could land you another fragrant branch of yore. However, if glitches are on the table, the lack of invisible walls does mean you can jump over here from the other side of the level using something like the moon jump. There aren't any walls protecting it from this angle because they wanted you to be able to walk off the platforms and ledges on both sides. Somewhere nearby where they did include invisible walls was down over here. The branches brought you dangerously close to an out-of-bounds area. On the opposite side of the King's Gate, we find a very tall invisible wall extending above the far end of this platform. It looks like they really didn't want you trying to get onto the roots, which you wouldn't have been able to stand on anyways, as they don't have any collision. And regarding the Pursuer, we have some interesting stuff going on with invisible enemy walls. This arena is protected so the Pursuer can't pass through it and won't fall off. However, it wasn't made to work with all enemies. The Hollows can pass through it just fine, which is why they're able to chase you out of here. So the enemy walls are made to have considerations for specific enemies, and this will lead to some weird stuff elsewhere. For example, let's take a look at the proper Pursuer boss room. This is a really cool set of invisible walls. Not only is the Pursuer protected from falling outside of the arena, but there's actually a pretty generous invisible floor for him as well. So he's really not too cramped in here and could safely travel pretty far from the ledge. This was surely designed with the idea that he floats in mind. The Souls games usually aren't very good at making floating or flying capable enemies actually do that. Aside from the Dark Souls 1 ghosts, it's usually just a visual thing. If an enemy appears to be floating, they're still really just walking along the ground and will fall off a cliff. The Pursuer works the same way, but they thought about this and decided to give him some invisible floors, knowing that the visual appearance of him floating would make players not really question it if they see it. However, the way they flagged this seems to have included some other enemies by accident. Unlike the Hollows earlier in the level, these ones do interact with these invisible walls. Not that you'd ever see this normally, because it's not like they can follow you out here, but it's still a funny thing to see. I was hoping that I could use Alluring Skulls to lure him out there, as attacks and projectiles usually impact high collisions. But invisible enemy walls were only made for the enemy, and we don't have such luck. But then I remembered that the Yearn spell, which also lures enemies, opens up on its own after traveling far enough, even if it doesn't impact anything. So this is just something you can do and see for yourself without any glitches or mods after all. Incredible stuff. I should mention that these nearby enemies weren't here at all in the original vanilla version of the game, so adding them here for Scholar of the First Sin is probably where things went wrong. However, it was set up originally, likely didn't need to exclude it from working on enemies other than the Pursuer, and by the time they were adding and moving enemies around in Scholar of the First Sin, they probably weren't thinking as much about stuff like enemy walls and simply overlooked it. Note that if you try this for yourself and it doesn't seem to work, it's not because he's fully stuck on the ledge or anything, it's just a separate issue with nav meshes, which is yet another aspect of the environment that we can now visualize in light gray. The invisible platform is not covered with a navigation mesh, meaning enemy AI doesn't want to think about charting the character into that space. However, enemies will usually try and attack something if it's close enough to them regardless. This is why if we cast Yearn too far out, he gives up and doesn't try to get closer than the nav mesh allows. But if we cast it from further back, so it opens up not too far off the ledge, that's how we can get him to go out there with it. To finish off the level, it's not surprising that the scenery of the last Giant's boss room is completely walled off, but it's kind of neat to see. We're not completely done here though, as there's a few things worth checking out in the Giant's memories. We'll find more of the expected stuff, taller walls surrounding a few perimeters, taller railings to prevent jumping into an out-of-bounds abyss, etc. But there's some weird stuff here too, as High Collision reveals some lost detail. In the memory of Vamar, we have these missing wooden beams that apparently used to protrude from the nearby tower. And because High Collisions block projectiles, it's maybe possible that someone noticed something weird here before if they ever shot arrows in this direction. But that seems incredibly unlikely, and I doubt anyone has ever spotted this without looking at the map data. Similarly, by the top of the nearby ladder, we also have what looks like more of the broken edge of this platform extending out a bit. And in the memory of Oro, wooden boards used to lay on top of these beams as well. Discarded elements remaining in the collisions is not something you'll see very often, so that's pretty cool. And speaking of which, we have a really weird one over in the memory of Jay. Turning left as soon as we get onto the walkway, we'll find an unused doorway behind the statue in the low collision, and going through underneath reveals another doorway beneath it. I initially didn't know what to make of this. I assumed this was just a misplaced map piece and was skeptical that it hinted at any kind of cut content relevant to this location, because at a first glance it didn't look like it fit here or was even part of the statue. It felt more like it was some discarded element that wound up overlapping it. And also the doorway below didn't seem to make sense as a path that belonged here. But then I took a closer look and found myself taking it more seriously as a prototype map concept, and the implications are fascinating. I started by toggling the map's rendering to get a better look at the collision, and would you look at that? If this was some random map piece originally meant for elsewhere, it'd be a really big coincidence for it to fit perfectly within or behind the statue. It has what appears to be the vague shape of a human torso, after all. So while the entrance appeared like a bit of a mismatch at first, the rest does look like an earlier design for part of the statue. And what about that lower doorway? Sure, where it winds up now doesn't seem great, but this was something that wasn't final and was obviously being experimented on. So before we take its placement too literally, we should be asking if a path in this general direction makes sense. And the answer to that is yes, very much so. Remember that the central design concept of the Giant's memories was being able to see this fortress in the past. While it's under siege, it's overall less in ruins than it is in the present day, and we're able to explore parts of it in the past that are inaccessible in the present day as well. But what if the memory of Jay originally intended for us to be able to explore more of this area beyond just the starting hallway? It is the smallest map of the Giant's memories, after all. So, what would a path heading out below the statue offer? In the present day, we can fall through the broken walkway and wind up below. On this bottom level, we don't get to see what's beyond the rubble on this side, which is closer to where the statue would be. And then we also have the middle of this drop-down area. Upon closer inspection, it's hiding an unused space. There's room for an entire other floor here we didn't get to see at all. So walking through the statue would have given us access to new parts of the fortress, which is extremely in line with the whole design concept of the memories in the first place. But what about the practicality of walking through the statue? It'd be kind of weird to go inside, because I feel like it's a little small for that. And it would also be strange to need to have something like a hallway below attaching it to the building. But there's a couple things to consider. The first is how the statue is holding its shield. This shield contains a tower behind it we don't get to enter. So that on its own already increases the plausibility that it was meant to have some usable floor space in some way. And then we should also consider how the statue doesn't have anything like a hand holding the shield, because the tower itself is too thick. so the statue was designed to have a hand clipping through it. The arm going into the tower really looks to me now like a previous consideration for how a hallway from the statue could have led into this area. This is all in addition to the placement of the statue being different between the past and present. In the past, it's snuggled up a lot more tightly against the building. In the present day, there's this pretty big gap. I don't believe the discrepancy here is intentional at all, in terms of lore, because that doesn't make any sense. The fortress is more ruined in the future, no one would have rebuilt and moved this entire statue between the events of the memories and the present day. It's just something we're not really meant to notice or think about too much. When we consider that the statue seems to have been considered as a pathway to the lower floors, it's not surprising to see the statue moved closer against the building, where the developers would have had more flexibility in making connecting paths. In the end, I'd guess that the size of the statue was probably a knock against it. It would have been very cramped in there, the camera probably would have been a nightmare, and it would have taken a lot of work to model its inside. When we see how the Iron Keep addressed this, by giving us a much larger statue to go inside where it was easier to fit a playable game space, it starts to feel a lot like that's where they salvaged the idea of going into a large statue. We're able to make reasonable speculation about all of this just from some weird junk left behind in the collision data. That sort of stuff will always be fascinating to me. Okay, let's move on to Heide's Tower of Flame. Overall, there's not much to see here for obvious reasons. Things are pretty much as open as they look, as you don't have to worry about the player getting somewhere out of bounds when almost every platform and walkway is surrounded by a deadly fall. And then opposite of that, you also have a couple of rooms that are completely enclosed spaces, so neither of these things demand the use of invisible walls. I do find it interesting how these distant platforms near the start of the level have collisions. I don't think it's indicative of anything in particular, like as if we were ever meant to be able to go over there, but it's still completely unnecessary. If anyone glitched their way over there and couldn't stand on them, they wouldn't have been surprised. But since we can stand on them, and it is possible to jump that far using the moon jump glitch, consider going over there and placing some illusory wall messages. I like the idea of confusing some players online and making them wonder if there's a secret over there or something. I like seeing what this walkway actually looks like. It's no surprise that it's a completely solid bridge, but I know some players will try jumping here, especially since it looks like there's a gap and a bit of an incline on the way back. But that's all artificial. The bridge we walk on is completely solid and flat. Really, the only invisible walls I could find here are in the PvP arenas. The left arena has these higher platforms you can't get on top of, but in addition to lacking collision to stand on, they are walled off with a taller invisible wall. And something curious here is how the high collision also ignores the actual layout, something you don't see very often. The shape of it clearly conveys the earthen wall below, extending up higher. And on top of it, we find that it's not perfectly flat. It has this distinct shape, which happens to perfectly match the layout of the stonework beneath it. This strongly suggests that these out-of-bounds platforms on the perimeter used to be higher up, and were brought down closer to eye level, maybe because it looked nicer. It also might have not been a lot of work to make a change like that. Flying higher up reveals how thrown together the architecture of this space really is. The columns weren't made to connect to the ceiling in a sensible way, and in fact, the gap here could be further evidence of how these wall sections were simply lowered. The right arena also has some railing protection to help ensure that players stay in bounds. But something kind of funny about it is how far the invisible wall sticks out from the railing. You can't even get close to it. It makes it seem like it's this small step here responsible for blocking your movement, but if it was really only that tall, you'd be able to jump up towards the railing. And here's something else where the high collisions reveal another change. This arena has these massive eagle warrior statues surrounding it, something you can barely see normally since you don't get a vantage point from outside the arena. They're already super huge as they are, but the high collisions reveal an even bigger version of them. Now that we know that's there, it's yet another spot we can watch our projectiles get stuck in the air. Something else not really relating to invisible walls, but just another oddity regarding collisions, is the floor in the Dragon Rider's boss room. Remember that the room has an incomplete floor, unless you choose to pull a couple levers that raise platforms to fill up the outer rings. The rising platforms are of course made of objects, being a dynamic element. Just like every other object that serves as a bridge or platform, I was expecting the object's collision to handle the job entirely. It's not like you normally find low collisions running along the same spaces. But we do find that here. The entire room is covered with a sheet of low collision to begin with. This is weird because obviously both the player and boss can fall out of the arena before you raise both platforms. When low collisions are normally what hold us in place, why can we just fall right through this? What's happening here is that it might be a bit of an oversimplification to say that objects are dynamic and environmental collisions aren't. Low and high collisions aren't ever going to be seen moving and rotating like objects, they are completely static in that sense. But collisions can have flags set to toggle them. So you can have pieces of low collision that are or aren't active yet, depending on the circumstance. But the thing is, this really isn't very common. The only other spot in the entire game where I'm aware this happens is for the pirate ship in No Man's Wharf. Maybe it happens in some other places too, but I haven't seen it elsewhere yet. Right at the start, we find taller walls protecting the stalagmites. This is what you'd expect. They basically always cover these like this in all of their games, because otherwise you're just asking the player to get stuck in them if they try jumping towards them. We also find taller walls, protecting the much shorter rocks as we enter the level. I'm not sure this was particularly necessary, as we're able to fall to our death into the water everywhere else in the level, so this didn't really need to be protected, but then again the devs might just want to stop you from climbing on things you weren't meant to. I like seeing how the collision for this rope works. You can't walk through the rope, but you can walk through this open space here, so as you might expect, it's just an incomplete railing that cuts off where it has more clearance. Now, the most interesting part about No Man's Wharf is how the level is divided essentially into two halves, with a shortcut you can drop connecting them in Scholar of the First Sin. But the second half of the level never feels that far out of reach from the beginning, with fairly minor obstacles blocking the way, like this rubble pile, and this railing made of rope. But how good of a job did they do protecting getting around this stuff? The answer is not very, and I've learned about 3 places where you can do a shortcut. Let's start with this rubble pile. We can see how they made it taller than it really is, to make sure we couldn't easily climb it and get over it. But unlike the cone rocks in Majula, which ensured you'd slide off of them, you would be able to easily walk on top of it so long as you can get on top in the first place. That's where the Dist Wharf skip comes in, named after speedrunner Distortion 2. Now, maybe it's because I lack the skill and precision of a speedrunner, but I actually find this jump very difficult. You have to really optimize getting close, but not too close so you don't bump into this wall along the way and slow down too much. So I would say the invisible wall is still pretty effective. No one would ever do this skip by accident, and most who think to try it without previous knowledge of it would probably think it's impossible. But it still easily could have been made impossible just by making it a little taller, or slippery, or both. Then we have this railing up here. We can see that they failed to add extra invisible walls, with the collisions more or less matching what you see visually. The only part that's really blocked off is this corner over here. I learned about the skip from Exu on YouTube. You can do a running jump from the Pharos Lockstone contraption to get over the rope. This is also a pretty tricky jump though, because jumping from a descending slope like the staircase seems to really kill the height of your jump. This means you want to jump from on top of the Lockstone platform before touching the stairs, where you're now jumping from pretty far away. The angle of the platform puts the right side of it closer to the rope, but jumping from the right side comes with its own issues of potentially hitting the higher part of the rope, or angling too far to the left so you roll off the wrong side. Finding the right angle really feels like a balancing act. However, if you just go upstairs in the nearby building, clearing the rope now becomes incredibly easy. This doesn't require any real precision. Most players who try it will probably get it right on their first try. But of course, this is all really low stakes stuff. No Man's Wharf isn't a very big level, so this isn't a major skip. But nonetheless, it's still interesting to see where not being aggressive enough with invisible walls allows this to happen. If you're wondering, don't you have to ring the bell to complete the level anyways, bear in mind that you can shoot it from a distance. Before we move on to the Lost Bastille, I wanted to point out how this house with all of the Darkstalkers is also hiding some removed wooden boards on its roof in its high collisions. Earlier in the level, we have another example of a house with some boards on its roof, so it gives us an idea of what they were going for. But the funny part is that, in spite of these boards being the ones that actually remained in the level, the top floor of this building didn't get high collisions at all. So go figure they'd remain in another part of the level where they didn't even wind up. The top floor lacking high collision made me realize you could shoot arrows through it, and so then I wondered if this could be done from the inside. But then realized this was the building where you can't get up to its second floor, as the stairs are blocked with rubble. But while we're here, this is what the invisible wall for that looks like. When we enter the Lost Bastille from No Man's Wharf, we eventually make our way to this broken bridge. The far side of this bridge is protected with an invisible wall, and this is because it's an entirely out of bounds area that we can't normally get to. Make a mental note of that tower in the distance for now, as we travel from the servants' quarters bonfire. We'll get to the spot where we're normally meant to drop down onto this roof, but we have this rubble pile and nearby wall protected with invisible walls as well. This is blocking the same tower we were just looking at a moment ago from another angle. What's interesting to me is that this out-of-bounds area does have collision, so if you were able to get over here, you could explore the small unused chunk of the level. Just being able to walk here isn't the strongest evidence that this was ever considered to be an actual part of the level. Sometimes rooftops and other structures we're never meant to get on top of have collisions as well. But while collisions extending this far into an out-of-bounds area is at least a little unusual to start with, what's a lot more tantalizing is that this area is also covered in nav meshes. That is not normal for out-of-bounds structures. So I suspect that it might be a leftover from earlier in development, where they were considering having the dead end be all the way over here after passing through the tower, before deciding to simplify it by cutting off access back here instead. Or maybe it could have connected on the other side. This side could have been a return drop-down path. Regardless of whatever the previous intention was, I like seeing unused spaces of the map that can be tweaked into existence with a bit of modding. Just add some wooden boards here to make a bridge, get rid of the junk clipping into the tower, and add textures for walls to a couple spots so you don't see through the map. That's all it should take to make this part of the level usable. I could easily imagine a chest inside the tower, or an item corpse dangling over this ledge, and so on. Now, let's switch gears to as if we entered via bird transport and found ourselves at the Tower Apart bonfire. Progressing just a little bit into the level makes it so that you quickly reach a point of no return, not being able to walk back to the bonfire. It's such an inconspicuous little drop here that it often surprises and confuses players that there isn't a viable path back. Displaying the collisions reveals how dead set the developers were on making it work this way, with the way the rubble pile is blocked off, and especially this bit here, which doesn't look like a major obstacle, but it is really thoroughly covered. Heck, even the spot where we drop in has this harsh, taller wall next to it, as they really wanted the entrance here to be a one-way bottleneck, despite the area looking a bit more open at first glance. The arena where we first meet the pursuer, at least coming from this direction, is a little more enclosed than I realized. The biggest environmental hazard for the player is the big pit in the corner of the room, but I always assumed there were a few places where you can also fall out of the map along the perimeter. There is one spot here that's open, but it's pretty narrow and that's all that there is. This broken segment of wall on the other side isn't actually a hazard, it's protected by a taller invisible wall than is obvious. We also get to see a continuation of what was already put into practice in the Pursuer boss fight earlier. Because he floats, they decided to not make pits a hazard for him. This pit is completely covered up with enemy collision, so if anyone ever tried to lure him in there, that's why that didn't work. There is also a cooler example of this for the Pursuer found in the secret rooftop area. This is more like the boss room in the Forest of Fallen Giants, where you have a much wider set extension of sorts that helps prevent him from falling off of the roof. There is a slight missed opportunity here though, where they could have helped make his hovering abilities more apparent to the player. There's an item corpse you have to do a jump to get to, and it does have a nav mesh connecting it, meaning the Pursuer should be able to cross the gap and kick your ass for trying to get away. However, a recurring design choice for the Pursuers is that if you leave the intended boundaries of their fight, they immediately despawn and won't come back until you refresh the area. It adds a bit of pressure so you can't just run off and heal with more safety. Unfortunately, they made this platform to be considered as outside of the fight zone. So despite connecting it with an invisible floor and nav mesh, in practice it doesn't get used as the Pursuer won't follow you over there. That's kind of a shame. But this time they did fix the invisible collision here so as to not include other nearby enemies. So unlike in the Forest of Fallen Giants, the nearby soldier will fall off of the roof as it's supposed to. Speaking of which, this out-of-bounds rooftop next to the nearby soldier is well protected. Unsurprisingly, we find more enemy walls protecting the gargoyle's rooftop, so they can't fall off either. And while the player can fall off, the sections with walls were made a lot taller than they appear. Here's a useless skip that's only possible in the original version of Dark Souls 2, which I'll continue to refer to as Vanilla. If you wanted to get into Macduff's workshop without using the exploding barrel, from the Sinner's Rise, you can jump over this to land on top of this railing below, and then continue along in this direction. This first part is still possible in Scholar of the First Sin, but let's take a look at this demonstration from Lishban on YouTube to see where this differs. They're able to jump onto this railing, which allows continuing further along. This isn't possible in Scholar of the First Sin though, where they made these walls taller. This introduces a whole can of worms here. Where are all of the places where stuff like this was changed between the two versions of the game? Unfortunately, most modding tools are created only for Scholar of the First Sin, so it's not as easy to look closely at what was different in vanilla. Nonetheless, we do know of a few specific places where it changed, and we'll still be able to compare and contrast a couple more things like this, where the difference is still obvious in some way when looking at the footage. So what else can we find here? Here's a few smaller oddities. I like how the wedge at the base of this ladder isn't part of the ladder's actual object. The collision fur is standard low collision, same as any other nearby wall or floor. Of course, there's nothing wrong with doing things this way. It shows that the developers were thinking about how to make a ladder have an obvious front side when descending into the middle of a room. Otherwise, you might try to climb it from the wrong side and be confused at first when it doesn't work. But rather than creating a unique kind of ladder for it, which would have been my original assumption, they basically just drew this extra bit at the bottom around it as part of the level itself. The entrance to the Belfry Luna appears to have another unused entrance right underneath the normal entrance. There's nothing else to go on, but considering how small the area is, it wouldn't be too surprising if there was originally a consideration to have to climb one more floor to get to the top. Something else that's kind of interesting about the space is how cramped it is relative to the outside structure. When you climb this ladder, it's up against a wall, but you'll find more space on top of the tower beyond it. And it's not that this tower gets wider at the top, so it means that there's an extra space beyond this wall on all floors that didn't get used. If we clip the camera through, we can see that the extra space is textured, and there is collision in there as well. That's pretty much it. Down here I guess I was surprised by how much further out the solid ground went. Because you can't see through the water here at all, and the only thing out here is an item along the wall, I think I always assumed you had to hug the wall pretty tightly. But here's what the ground out here actually looks like. Alright, let's move on to the Huntsman's Copse. Right off the bat, I want to take a closer look at how this tent is blocked off. It's not at all surprising that it is, but I guess I never realized how you can't even really get that close to it from this angle, with the rubble pile on the ground being taken into consideration for the placement of the invisible walls here. Seeing the before and after of these invisible walls really does a good job, to me at least, at conveying the illusion of space in a video game. When I try walking back and forth between the bonfire and the tent, we have almost no room to move at all. This bonfire is essentially as close to a wall as it can possibly be, with just enough room for the player to pass through. But does this look like a bonfire that's directly up against the wall? Even knowing the invisible wall is there, it just doesn't feel that cramped. Video games can use invisible walls and unexplorable nooks to lie to us about how much open space there truly is in an environment, and our brains will eat that right up. I get a similar feeling in the cave behind the illusory wall down here. Again, it's no surprise that the cages along the wall aren't a part of the room's walkable space, but something about toggling the invisible walls into view makes the room suddenly feel a lot smaller. In this level, there are some mounds that aren't climbable that I guess I wasn't totally expecting, because it shouldn't have mattered if you got onto anything nearby. I found a small spot in the Skeleton Lord's boss room where the high collision doesn't match the shape of the floor very well. Once again, it's taller than it should be, so you can get your feet to do funny things because of it. In the bridge arena, the high collision reveals some extra scenery, some kind of hanging structure that's no longer here. Like the removed wooden boards of the Giant's Memories, you could hypothetically be aware that something weird is happening there if you happen to shoot an arrow in the right direction, but that seems very unlikely and probably no one ever noticed that. Some of the collisions of the decorations here are a bit misaligned from their final placements as well, but being distant scenery that no one is going to interact with, it's not a problem. Though in this other arena, I did find some pillars with high collision that's simpler than it probably should be, making it into a wider obstacle for your attacks than is obvious. Otherwise, I didn't really find too much to talk about in the Huntsman's Copse. If we can get an easier way to compare the maps between the different versions, I'd not only be curious to see if there's any differences between Scholar and Vanilla, but also the network test. For those who weren't around at the time, the network test demo of Dark Souls 2 was set in the Huntsman's Copse, so it's the first area of Dark Souls 2 players got to experience and do a bunch of PvP in. Being more heavily playtested, I'm not really surprised to not find any major oddities here in the final version of the game. In Scholar of the First Sin, before you enter the Harvest Valley, if you try turning around, you might find yourself getting stuck here, which is really no big deal as you can easily go around or jump over the problem. but I think most players never have a chance to notice, since backtracking on foot between the Harvest Valley and Huntsman's Copse isn't normally an option. There's a one-way path into Harvest Valley thanks to this broken ladder, and even if you could get back, the incentive to backtrack on foot really isn't even there when bonfire warping exists. That's all to say that few people have probably ever noticed this, despite being obvious if you try walking here. The cause is a bit of low collision that angles up higher than it should and doesn't connect neatly to the next piece of ground. It's not an intentional invisible wall in any way. Now that we know it's here, anytime someone walks between the two areas, you can spot a brief moment where the player quickly drops down when crossing that transition. But for some reason, this only exists in Scholar of the First Sin. Vanilla doesn't have this issue, so it's very curious that something was changed here at all. This isn't a part of the level that had anything like enemy placements modified. There aren't any noteworthy intentional differences in this location that we know of. So how or why something like this got messed up between the releases is a total mystery. We'll find that most rocks along the walls are completely covered up so you can't get on top of them. In the first open area, we find that this out-of-bounds area is completely covered up, due to being pretty close and nearly within jumping distance, so they didn't want to take any chances there. However, this precaution is pretty funny when we see what happened in the next area. They also tried to cover up all the rocks here with much taller invisible walls, however you can see that they sort of forgot to bother with this section in the middle. So there's a speedrunning trick that players do where they'll jump around this wall to the unprotected section, navigate this out-of-bounds space, and then drop back into the level over here. This is a relatively small chunk of the level that's being skipped, but most importantly, it allows you to skip pulling this lever and having to wait for the gate to open. Instead of dropping back into the level, you can do a little bit of out-of-bounds exploration here, but there's not much to see before you'll just fall out of the map. Making our way into the Earthen Peak, I think I talked about this in my out-of-bounds exploration video, but this out-of-bounds staircase in Jabba the Hutt's room is completely covered up on all sides, trying to keep us away from stairs that really led to nowhere. I like how they handled this pit at the start of the level. There are some stone structures down here that should probably be a survivable fall, but they made their collision into these really steep triangles to ensure that you can't land on them and will just slide off instead. However, you may remember from my video on invisible walls in Dark Souls 1 that it is possible to land on top of paper-thin collisions as long as they're sufficiently vertical. Does that mean we can land on this, as long as we land perfectly in the middle? Unfortunately, you can't place a message down here. It's going to do the same thing as before, where it teleports back up. Now, let's take a look at this precarious path. I wondered if this was going to be like the small bridge in Heide's tower, where it was actually a bit safer than it looks, but that's not the case at all. The low collision here pretty much matches what you see exactly, so you don't want to get overconfident. It's not possible to cross just hugging the wall, you do have to make a jump. I have to admit to completely forgetting that the next segment of ground beyond this is a breakable object as well. It'll collapse if you hit any part of it, including the railing, but I think most players will never encounter this, as the enemy tends to hang back and you'd sort of have to go out of your way to get him to fight you on this spot. Which made me wonder, what did Vanilla do here again? Instead of having a Grave Warden all the way back by the chest, Vanilla had a Desert Sorceress on the breakable ground instead, who'd spam her fire attack as you approached. It turned this spot into a unique environmental hazard, where if you rushed out to fight her, you might be punished for not heeding the poor state of the walkway. However, once you know it's here, you can break it and then it becomes a hazard for the enemy instead, where she becomes very easy to knock off. The environmental hazard previously had a clear purpose, where it could work for or against the player, but now in Scholar of the First Sin, it's just kind of there and a lot less likely to be interacted with. And it reminds me a bit of the dark hallway in the Forest of Fallen Giants. In Scholar, it's populated with skeletons, but you'll notice that the nearby columns are objects. These skeletons can't break them though, so why are they here? It's because Vanilla had those turtle guys down here instead, and they could smash them. I'm not someone who'll go so far as to say that the vanilla version of Dark Souls 2 is better than Scholar of the First Sin. I think Scholar edges the original out a little bit overall, but there was a lot of discourse around the time of its release where it received near universal praise for improved enemy placements, and it was treated as if Scholar was the definitive version of the game that was better in practically every way. This never felt right to me, as I always saw the changes as something of a mixed bag. There are for sure positive changes as well, but in looking at how the environment was constructed, Scholar sometimes makes some weird choices that seem to forget the original design intent. This results in some changes to enemy placement that are a downgrade from what they previously had. Before we move on to the Iron Keep, I wanted to take a closer look at the weird room I showed in my Out of Bounds video. Way off in the distance, we have an unused room of some kind, which I showed in the map data, but in game, It's not textured, and the best I could do was drop some prism stones on it. But now the collisions give us a much clearer look. I wasn't totally sure what this room was before, but it was suggested to be an alternate exit to the level, and I think that's gotta be it. You have the elevator shaft here, and the curving hallway nearby, although the final version had an extra room with a right-hand turn preceding the hallway. Knowing that figuring out how to connect the different levels was something that was rushed and tweaked pretty late into development, the game hiding some leftover experiments on how to exit the level really isn't a big surprise in hindsight. One thing I noticed in the Iron Keep is that the entrance to the boss room has a slightly wider flap to it, to help prevent the player from jumping back out of the arena. They also put a cone above this nearby pillar, so you couldn't jump over to that either. Perhaps they feared it as a potential stepping stone for finding a way around the fog gate as well. I also found a sort of different use of an invisible enemy wall here. Rather than trying to keep the boss trapped within a given space along with the player, it's here to do the opposite and keep him properly distanced. Aside from that, I couldn't find other invisible walls of interest, but there's a few other funny things I can point out though. In the room with the platforms that can be lowered into the lava, there's this sort of lava trough running along the wall. And although it's normally out of reach, we can get on top of it using the moon jump glitch, as it wasn't protected with an invisible wall. It's purely visual and doesn't hurt the player at all. From the boss room, I also noticed this random plane of low collision in the distance. In looking under the lava, I tried to see if it was connected to anything more interesting, but I got nothing. But then I realized I could make its associated high collision load by standing on top of its edge, and it revealed what was previously just another rock pillar out here. It's not surprising that stuff like that would get changed and moved around, but none of the existing pillars have any remaining low collision at all, so seeing a chunk in blue over there is a bit of an anomaly regardless. Lastly, I'd like to ask, what the hell is going on with the Smelter Demon room? There used to be a glitch, maybe it still exists and is just less common, I have no idea, but there was a time when players in vanilla Dark Souls 2 commonly reported getting stuck along the outer wall. You would slide to the outer edge of the room and not be able to get out of there. While I don't have an explanation for this, we can find the remnants of something that is surely related in some way. The room has this sheet of high collision running along the walls, but it sticks out a bit. This isn't the same collision of the outer wall itself, it's something extra. It's almost certainly meant to be enemy collision. Since the outer walls have these recessed nooks, and these bits that stick out above, it seems likely that the Smelter Demon was having some issues getting stuck along the wall, or clipping out of bounds. So they put this extra shell here to keep him away. That all makes sense, but how could enemy collision mess with the player? If we're not meant to interact with it, we should be able to walk right through it. And we can, but there's a catch. It messes with our camera. The moment we pass through, the camera suddenly zooms in closely on our back, as if we have our back up against a wall. Why does the camera get stuck in this space? I don't have the answer to that question. I'm not sure the Dark Souls 2 collisions have been data mined at a level where we can see all of their parameters and know exactly what each of them do. But the point is that other enemy collisions don't have the same behavior. You can pass through other ones without the camera getting caught on them. This is pretty good evidence that something was set incorrectly here. What should have been a normal enemy wall very likely had some incorrect values set, allowing it to interact with the player in ways it shouldn't. What we're seeing here now in Scholar of the Furson, I'm guessing is a fixed version of what was previously even more broken, but even this fixed version is still janky in its own way. Here's a funny clip that was submitted to me by my brother. He had the Smelter Demon yeet him out of bounds in his first playthrough, creating some really lucky accidental cheese when he re-entered the boss room and it was no longer aggroed. While that's the player getting knocked out of bounds and not the Smelter Demon, the fact that it happened at all might have created some anxiety about the Smelter Demon staying in bounds, and could be part of the reason why they felt like they needed some extra enemy invisible walls in here. And that's not even all the weird stuff that's in here. There's also a couple rings of high collision floating above. Unlike the enemy wall, I'm confident this wasn't intended for the Smelter Demon, as the player's inverse kinematics interact with it, and our projectiles will impact it as well. So this does appear to be normal environmental collision. When we consider how ornate the room is with these bending archways along the wall, it seems very plausible that the ceiling space was originally meant to be more detailed as well. But considering how the Smelter Demon has that jumping plunge attack, they probably needed more clearance and had to remove whatever these circles were going to be a part of. At least that's what makes the most sense to me. Regardless, they were doing a bunch of messing around in this room, and some of it came out weird. Now, let's move on to the Shaded Woods. Having lots of rubble and being set along this sort of sunken outdoor path, a lot of it is what you'd probably expect. Slightly steeper and taller walls than what we can see visually to help keep us in bounds. This column here was made to be much taller, which was likely done to help prevent turning it into a stepping stone for getting out of bounds. Unsurprisingly, windows along the main path are superficial, but something I wasn't expecting to be completely covered as well was this window space near the Shaded Ruins bonfire. Not only is the rubble pile blocked, but the entire space is blocked from the opposite side as well. I guess the small bit of rubble at the bottom is meant to tell us that it's impassable, but there's another room nearby that lets you navigate the underside of the walkway by jumping through to the exterior path. And visually, it really looks like the player should be able to fit through it, so they should have either made this an open jump you can do as well, or the rubble should have been more obvious that it was fully blocking it. We've had other invisible walls that were maybe a bit sloppy, inadequate, or glitchy, but this is the first one I've seen that made me feel like it shouldn't be there at all. I also wonder if there's another reason this came out a little crude, because it looks like this room originally had different plans. The high collision reveals whatever the heck this was. There's not enough detail to clarify what the structure would have been, but my first thought is that it'd be something that would have a lever on it, but I'm basing that solely on vibes. Your guess is as good as mine. Seeing the covered up doorway space next to it might be causing me to connect dots incorrectly, but I'm imagining something that could have opened that wall originally. Though that wouldn't make any sense for the way the level is currently designed, so if that's what it was originally for, it makes sense that it was removed. I think there's some support for the broader idea that this walkway in the Shaded Ruins might have been reworked in such a way where the environment surrounding it could have been completely reconsidered at some point earlier. Something I talked about pretty extensively in my Out of Bounds video is how the Shaded Woods is full of unused paths, and this particular walkway is a set piece that we get to see a simplified, low-poly version of in Majula. So it seems like the concept of the set piece probably existed early on, but with the Shaded Woods showing lots of signs of tweaking its paths and connections, on top of finding this really weird thing inside it, it really seems like it was something that was heavily reworked at some point. Speaking of unused paths, I'd like to backtrack to this rubble pile earlier in the level. There's that weird hole, possibly the entrance of an unused tunnel. It seems like it could just be a random environmental detail, but the fact that it's so hard to see clearly from inbounds angles makes it feel more like something that was covered up and left unused. Invisible extensions above the rubble help prevent us from climbing to get a closer look, and a much taller invisible wall completely blocks us from getting back there. The area surrounding the head of Vengarl has some very tall invisible walls for some reason. It doesn't hurt anything to have them here, of course, but they're just so much taller than other walls in the area. But the real elephant in the room, well, okay, I'm not talking about that guy, but it's the Shrine of Winter. If you're not already familiar with the discourse surrounding it, this rubble pile is something that got made fun of back in the day, and for good reason. It's kind of absurd that such a major progression point is blocked in a way where, in real life, you'd be able to climb over to the other side of the path very easily. Now, before anyone comes to its defense, I get it. Video games are allowed to be video gamey, and that's okay. And defenders of Dark Souls 2 might feel inclined to point out unrealistic obstacles in other Souls games. Like, if this door doesn't require a key and it only needs to be opened from the other side, what's stopping you from sticking your hands through and doing it from here? Or in different kinds of games entirely, there's all sorts of dead ends that we simply accept because we understand that only making realistic obstacles isn't remotely necessary. However, just because we can defend games doing this in general doesn't mean that this isn't still very funny. Like, imagine telling someone you needed to kill the reincarnation of 4 gods in order to get to the other side of this path. That's kind of what this feels like, and that's why it stands out. What makes this even funnier is its history of being exploitable. You would think that an important obstacle that looks easily scalable would be high on the priority list for going hard with invisible walls. And while it is well protected without using major glitches today, it took a few patches to get there. This video from Lobos Jr. shows what was possible in the 1.0 version of vanilla. I'm going to skip over the first part of the video, but to summarize it, there's a bit of setup where you jump onto this rock further up the hill, make your way along the path from higher up, and then you do this.
Ooh, just barely made it. Okay, and now in the original version of the game, there is no collision right here, and you are able to drop right here.
To address this, they added collision here in the first patch. This is what it looks like. However, another skip was discovered that worked after patch 101. This also has some setup that I'll skip, but basically you'd start off by getting onto the same hill, but you'd turn right instead, and I'll allow this demonstration from Noobist to show its final steps.
Here you don't want to go too much to the right. If you do, you fall off to this side and you won't make the skip. But if you go too much to the left, you will fall off and die. So I just line right here, I guess, and do a running jump. Well, I guess you can't jump without running, but yeah, that's it. And now you're here. You can just walk past the shrine from here, and that's pretty much it.
This was good until patch 106, until that was finally removed as well. We can get a closer look at a few things that changed. To start with, we can no longer get on top of the rock that Lobo started with. It's this bit here that they added. Once Lobos was up here, he made the final jump from over by this tree. But we can no longer even get up to that tree. There's a tall invisible wall further down the hill now. Nubist's demonstration had him jumping up onto the hill further down the path instead of the rock, and although we can still jump onto that same initial spot, the rest of the collisions up here being steeper and blocking the top of the hill means we can no longer walk up and along it. The final steps of his route had him walking along the top of the edge of the previous collision that was here. But if I go on top of it now, you can see that I'm much higher up. Meaning, they not only moved some of this further down the hill to block getting on top, but the top of the walls are higher up now too. Now, I should clarify that even the fully unpatched skip shown by Lobos was a bit tricky, and I don't really fault the game for not initially protecting these hills super well. They are facing in the wrong direction. But when we see how the area by the head of Vengarl got these huge invisible walls, it feels funny that this was previously left open, and that there weren't like giant massive wings surrounding the Shrine of Winter building and this rubble pile down here. To my knowledge, the Shrine of Winter is the only part of the game we're currently aware of that had to be patched more than once. They had these spots where it seems like protecting them should have been a very obvious thing to do from the start, but the devs were also seriously crunched, so there's that. There's not too much to say about the Doors of Pharos, so I'm going to quickly mention it here with the Shaded Woods before moving on. Like any cave we're not supposed to be able to get into, spaces like this that appear to be pretty wide open are unsurprisingly completely covered up. And at the beginning of the level, I think we have another good demonstration of low collision versus high collision for inverse kinematics. We have these rocks sticking out of the water, where if you look closely at them, they're actually pretty severe with how tall they are. This is something where if the low collisions matched the visuals, we would get stuck on them. It looks like we can walk up onto it no problem, but again, that's just the high collisions telling our feet where to go. What we're actually standing on is a much broader and smoother ramp surrounding the rock than what we can see. This is what they have to do when they don't want you getting stuck on sudden inclines. In Brightstone Cove Tseldora, we can see how they walled off this corner of the building after the Prowling Magus fight. They didn't want you trying to get over to the other side until you're further down. And unsurprisingly, the columns immediately below are also covered up. And since we don't often find enemy walls outside of boss rooms and area transitions, I was surprised to find one in Cromwell's room, protecting the ladder leading into it. It seems like they wanted you to commit to the fight if you decided to aggro him, instead of being able to bait him to the cliff below and trying to knock him off from there. His AI already has a leash point that seems to stop him from following you all the way to the ladder anyways, but the invisible wall also ensures that you can't knock him down there. But why do I have a memory of fighting Cromwell down here? I double-checked Vanilla and it has the same enemy wall, so we can't chalk it up to version differences. It's been a very long time. Am I just misremembering things?
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the
Game mechanics.
No, we're wrong.
Check this out. Returning here after he's already been aggroed allows me to get him to come down the ladder. Why didn't the invisible wall at the top of the ladder stop him? It's because, as far as I can tell, his leash point is a bit finicky, and sometimes it allows him to get close enough to the ladder. And the entrance to the ladder can be accessed from the opposite side of the invisible wall. This likely forces an animation of him mounting the ladder that clips him through it. So this is all to say, you can't knock him down the ladder shaft, but you can get him to follow you. But with how tricky and inconsistent it can be to actually get him to follow you down the ladder, it does seem to be unintended, and like the invisible wall is being sidestepped in a way that it wasn't meant to be. And I believe that my initial guess about not wanting to kill him with fall damage probably holds true, since there's another invisible enemy wall down here that stops him from falling off of the cliff. A little further down, you have these out-of-bounds structures off to the side and above the normal parts of the level. If you were somehow able to get closer, you'd find that they're completely covered up, and you wouldn't have any way of walking along these platforms. Here's a couple more extremely minor things, but I noticed that in the room before Freya, we have a spider web that connects with this pillar. though the high collision reveals how it might have previously connected all the way to the outer wall. We can add this to the growing list of spots where we can watch our projectiles interact with something completely invisible to us. Completely unrelated to what we're talking about, it looks like the Forlorn ran out his multiplayer time limit. If you'd like to know more about how those work in Dark Souls 2, I made an entire video about that as well. Trust me, there's some weird obscure stuff even in mechanics like that. There's also this one platform over here that most people will never get on top of, as it requires doing an awkward jump from up above, or knowing to equip your moon butterfly gear, which enables the ability to jump from on top of the spiderwebs. Once you're up here, there's a bit of spiderweb that has high collision but no low collision at all, so we can once again stand on it in silly ways. Now might be a good time to point out how the inverse kinematics work differently from Dark Souls 1. In that game, if both legs were raised sufficiently, it'd make the entire player move higher up visually, even if their actual collision was remaining on something lower. In Dark Souls 2, it doesn't want to move the entire player's model, so you get the head and upper torso remaining stationary, so you can wind up with these squatting positions that aren't possible in Dark Souls 1. It kind of reminds me of that thing some birds do when they stabilize their heads. The Freya boss room contains an invisible wall to protect Freya, but it doesn't offer protection for the smaller spiders. They could still potentially fall out of the arena. In the Dragon Memories, the entire space is encircled with invisible walls. That's not unexpected, but what is a little unexpected is how tall they are. It really doesn't matter how tall you make walls like this, so there's nothing inherently funny about doing this, and you can probably find this in a lot of other video games. But nonetheless, I think they have to be the tallest invisible walls in Dark Souls 2, so they still stand out for that reason. They also made some of the rocks in the middle of this area taller than they really are to try and prevent climbing up to anywhere weird. Not that you'd be able to get far with how the entire area is protected anyways. Dropping down towards the Grave of Saints, I wanted to show what was solid and what isn't in the Majula pit. It's all mostly pretty obvious. All of the thinner boards are breakable objects, so you can't land on top of them. However, this one set of boards that instead form a wall are unbreakable. It's pretty clear they didn't intend for you to land on top of them, as they form a sharp peak of collision at the top. But again, if you can land perfectly centered on top of a vertical edge of collision, you can land on it. Not that you'd have any reason to want to go here. Here we have the rat head entrance. The low collision revealed a slightly larger rat head, but I wasn't sure if that was just the low collisions doing their usual thing of being bigger and blockier. But then the high collisions also match this. It's not only larger, but the shape of the snout is a bit different, with more of an upwards bent to it, so it does seem to hint at an earlier design. It makes sense if they did go through the process of making it smaller. It's not like it needed to take up even more of your field of view from the bonfire. The Grave of Saints also has these dead ends blocked by rubble, which are completely covered up. But if you could get past here and jump far enough, the out-of-bounds areas beyond them have a little bit of collision as well, both on this ground level area and up on the second floor. In this next room on ground level, I noticed that you couldn't get too close behind these rat statues. This is because they made the object's collision box much longer than it needed to be. Moonlight Ruin guesses that their collision might have been based on an earlier T-posed version of the object, accounting for a tail that didn't wind up being in the way. And while we're looking at objects, I noticed something pretty cool here. This staircase was also an object. But why? We have other walkways that are made of objects, because you'd have to use ferrous lockstones to move them into position. That makes sense, but these stairs don't move and can't be interacted with. If you've seen my video about the prototype gutter map, there's a section of the video that talks about how we can find all of these developer notes that got left behind, which hint at earlier intentions for the PvP traps of the Grave of Saints. This includes some stuff that didn't fully pan out or maybe work as well as what they originally envisioned. And while I didn't mention it in the video, if you paused to read all of them, you'll find one that talks about rotating the stairs, turning this entire room into a dead end. So I had to know, does this object have an unused rotating animation? It turns out it does. Moonlight Ruin made a demonstration for us, modding it back into the game. I think this would have been nice to have for Rat King PvP. While you can already turn this area into a dead end by lowering just the first drawbridge, that would require some foresight on what all the Pharaoh's contraptions do. Someone wanting to experiment with all of them would unlock both of the drawbridges, giving summoned victims another path through the area. Plus, not having the upper bridge already lowered might have been more obvious visually. While from over here, we'd be able to see if the stairs were already rotated or not, the prototype design notes seem to have the expectation that this area would have been very dark without a torch originally. Now, I'm going to skip over both the gutter and Black Gulch. I couldn't really find anything too interesting there. They're okay with having you fall to your death, and there's no point where they're not cool with you jumping from one platform to another if they're nearby. It's just not a space that needs invisible walls. So, on to Drangleic Castle. We find that the staircase leading to the entrance has tall walls surrounding it. I doubt that they cared about protecting the player. If you were to run and jump off the stairs, that'd be entirely your fault, and it's not like you can't also just walk off the nearby cliffs. A death plane blankets this whole area anyways, so the player would just die and it wouldn't cause any issues. However, when we get a closer look at the column supporting the bridge, we can see how messy and unfinished it looks. It just kind of floats there. So I feel like they didn't want you falling from here as a means to avoid tidying that up more. Or the invisible walls could be an unrelated coincidence, but how much work you have to put into designing a deadly pit so it doesn't look completely terrible when falling in is something the level designers have to consider for every pitfall they make. And you really don't want to waste a lot of time with the graphics of what are essentially out-of-bounds locations, so they're happy to use any shortcut available when they can, and putting up invisible walls so you're less likely to fall from somewhere in the first place is just one of their options for that. By the Cursed Nashandra painting, if you turn around you'll find this area that's completely covered up. If we go higher, we'll get to the staircase that leads to Nashandra, and we'll find that the railing is also protected, to stop us from going in the same direction as below. What we find back there is essentially an incomplete void, so similar to the beginning of the level, I think this sort of thing is less about protecting the player and more about reducing the workload. The view to Nashandra is completely blocked off with an invisible wall as well, though that didn't stop you from getting back there by going completely around it, using stuff like airwalking glitches. The high collisions are as open as they should be, allowing you to shoot projectiles over there. What's interesting about the high collisions though is how they once again hint at an earlier design. The archway was smaller and more constricted. And if we go inside, we can see how the roof is smaller and lower as well. So it wasn't just the archway. It appears this entire room was smaller at some point earlier in development. There is also taller railings outside the Dragon Rider's boss room, but not everything out here was protected perfectly. I'll link to a video below, but there's a series of very convoluted jumps you can do here, technically without glitching, which is helpful in setting up some speedrunning maneuvers for getting to the Throne of Want early. Ultimately, the culprit is having these tiny flat segments that just barely stick out above each column, and exploiting the moon butterfly gear to make jumps from a standing position. This feels less like a major oversight and more like speedrunners just pulling off ridiculous tricks, but nonetheless, an invisible wall that covered this rooftop more thoroughly is what the devs probably would have wanted to put here. In the Dragon Rider's room, you have these platforms in the corner that the boss can smash, with one of the Dragon Riders resting on top. Breaking it is how you get him to come down, but I guess I never really paid attention to how this was implemented. Because if the upper part breaks, does he have to jump down from or walk off of the lower platform or something? It turns out the solution is a lot cleaner and simpler than that. While the platform is of course an object with its own collision, hiding underneath it is low collision with a sort of invisible slide on top. So once the object breaks, the boss just slides off of this. I previously wondered about the aggro ranges of the old knights up in this room. There's one you can get pretty close to without it reacting, while the one on the opposite side seems capable of seeing you from much further away. It turns out the railings just have a much higher invisible wall than expected, blocking this one's line of sight until you round the corner. I also wanted to point out some polish found by the central elevator that I thought was pretty neat. I was surprised to find that every segment of archway here was an object, rather than just being a normal wall. Since we previously found objects of downgraded interactivity earlier, I was initially on alert for these maybe being breakable or having some other purpose earlier on. But that's not it at all. The reason for these being objects was fulfilled in the final game. They're here to make the camera not suck. They made objects so they can just turn transparent if they get between the camera and the player. And perhaps more importantly, the camera doesn't have to suddenly jump back and forth to hugging the player's back much more closely, something that would happen if these were just normal walls. So, as objects, the camera doesn't have to hit them or interact with them. I feel like if this was Demon Souls or Dark Souls 1, they would have just let the camera jump around while climbing this ladder. It's nice seeing how Dark Souls 2 started to think about improving the camera. On the way to the Looking Glass Knight, we have more pit protection. Wait a second, the script it says not that kind of pit protection in parentheses. Was I really gonna make a joke about deodorant? That's stupid. Anyways, the railing really is too high to get over in the first place, but they took an extra precaution because this is another pit they didn't want you seeing too closely or interacting with. It's just a flat black texture with no detail at all, so there's no good way of having the player fall through or onto it without it looking weird. And for the boss arena, while there are some sections of broken wall where it looks like you might be able to fall through them, or pieces of rubble that you might be able to climb or hide behind, I think you know the drill by now. This whole space is covered with taller walls that don't allow that. On the path to the Throne of Want, all these stalagmites get much taller walls covering them. The railing at the beginning also has taller walls, but it's not enough to stop you from simply landing on top from here. We can continue in this direction to get on the wall covering the stalagmite, so it's another funny spot we can float on. And inside the Throne of Want, invisible walls protect the bosses from falling out of the arena. Or at least it should, but this recent video from Bobdol Owned You reminded me that there's cheese for the Throne Watcher and Defender where you can get them to fall out of this corner. So what's up with that? As it turns out, despite carefully wrapping almost this entire arena with an invisible enemy wall, they messed up and left an opening over here. Throne Watcher fits through here no problem, but Splee mentioned that it was harder to get Throne Defender to fall and he used another cheese for them. As far as I can tell, it might actually be impossible to get Throne Defender to fit through here due to their larger size. I couldn't get him to fall no matter how hard I tried, as it seems like part of his collision capsule will always be resting atop the tile behind him. Just a few things to look at in the Shrine of Amana here. This mysterious hole is unsurprisingly covered up. We never had a chance of fitting in there regardless, our cylinder's already too wide for that, but it turns out that not even a beanpole was getting through. I like this corner back here by the pillar with the alluring skulls on it. There's obviously nothing back there, but just in case you tried, there's a big slide covering it that'll push you away. This dead end near the entrance to the boss has this rubble pile that is made to be a lot taller than what we can see. While getting on top wouldn't have allowed getting anywhere useful, they probably just didn't want you getting stuck in some of its recessed portions. And here's a look at the Demon of Songs arena. This is another space that uses distant scenery to feel a little less cramped than it really is. Man, they really put butterflies in some obscure locations in Scholar of the Furson. I might have complained about some revised enemy placement earlier in the video, but to say something in Scholar's favor, all of the extra butterflies and invisible hollows are extremely cool. It's just a weird change that players would have never asked for, and weird is good. I think that in the Shrine of Amana, the most worthwhile thing we can do with the collisions turned on isn't to go hunting for invisible walls, but instead to just get a better look at the playable game space. The dark water makes it hard to see where the boundaries of the level are from a distance. Not that it's particularly difficult to explore the level or anything, but you're surrounded by these cliffs that you can't see clearly unless you're looking down at your feet. While I doubt that there's any secrets hiding across the water you're not already familiar with, disabling the map from rendering and turning on the low collisions holds a similar novelty to me to visualizing the invisible walkways of the Crystal Cave in Dark Souls 1. It gives us a clearer look at a space where we normally have to tiptoe around its boundaries to feel safe. So here's a quick montage of that. In the Undead Crypt, while most of the sconces don't have collisions due to being too far away, a couple of the closer ones were given these cone-like ramps to make sure you'd slide off of them. Once again, if you can land on top perfectly centered, perhaps with a drop stab to halt movement, you should be able to land here. I did find it interesting that there was one other sconce that was close enough for players to try jumping on, but for that one they didn't bother with collisions at all, and you just fall straight through, so they forgot to put a cone here it seems. Also, I guess I never realized that there was another sconce hiding in the darkness. Once you know it's there, with the other ones lit up, it's not hard to see its chain. But like, why is it there? Why doesn't it light up with the rest? Beyond the ones we can see, there are also several more that don't light up. These ones I can understand not bothering with. They're going pretty far out of bounds, and maybe they just wanted this vantage point to cut off where it does. But it is kind of weird that this one in the middle of the level was left out too. It could be that they wanted these statues to not be fully illuminated. Maybe they figured they looked cooler each having a darker half or something. That, or maybe leaving it unlit was just a mistake. In Betwixt room, we have this really tall invisible wall enclosing the whole area. But what's interesting to me is that if you go beyond it, there's another set of smaller invisible walls that already would have stopped you from going further. So it seems like they started with this, before settling on an even taller one further in. I like how you run into these two-dimensional versions of the statues if you go further out of bounds. I wasn't expecting any of them to have collisions, but the first couple layers of 2D statues did get 2D sheets of high collision as well. It seems unnecessary, but I guess if you try shooting some of the statues that are pretty far away, you can still see your arrow hit them. I was not expecting that for statues that got condensed into 2 dimensions. The entrance to Aldia's keep has all of the staircases and railings along the right side protected. They didn't want you getting up to this out-of-bounds area. While we haven't been looking at enemy collisions, it's worth looking at a bit closer here. Unlike in Vanilla, this enemy doesn't attack you right away in Scholar, so you have to walk around it. When it comes to bumping into enemies, what we make contact with is referred to as their ragdoll. And again, what we bump into is determined by this larger cylinder.
A statue blocks your way. I feel like there's room just to go around him, but, you know, maybe not.
The dragon skeleton in Aldia's keep has this horn that nearly blocks this staircase. But thankfully its ragdoll collision is made shorter than what we can see, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to use these stairs. And while we can fit through spaces like this, there are times where the height of our capsule gets us a little caught in places where the reason for getting briefly stuck might not be the most intuitive visually. Now, bear in mind that an enemy's ragdoll isn't the same thing as their actual hitbox. For example, the hitbox of the giant basilisk is what we see in orange here. If our attacks make contact with any part of him wrapped in orange, he'll take damage. However, I wanted to point out the basilisk's ragdoll while we're here, because it's a lot more forgiving and offers more freedom of movement for the player than I was expecting. You can just completely walk through its legs and tail, no problem at all, because they don't have any ragdoll collision. There is nothing surprising about rubble protection, but sometimes I just like seeing what it actually looks like, and here's another example with this pile of golems. Now, I don't think anyone will be surprised that the boss room is completely enclosed, and that none of these openings are real, but there's a pretty wide-looking gap over here that I'm sure at least a few players have wondered if they can fall out of before. It turns out it's completely safe. In the Dragon Aerie, I guess I never really thought about how safe the rope railings are on the bridges. Unlike the one in No Man's Wharf that lets you fall under the tallest part of the rope, these are all protected for their entire length. The breakable one is of course made as an object instead, and though there's nothing to really see here, I just wanted to show it collapsing with its collision displayed. All of the Red Dragon arenas are enclosed and also have any holes in them covered up as well, with enemy walls that are just for the dragons specifically. By the entrance to the Dragon Shrine, we have something a bit unusual. There are spots along these rocks where the high collision matches the low collision exactly, instead of conforming to the rocks. And then we also have this spot with a much taller sheet of high collision, where not even the low collision is that big. This has to be a mistake. There's no reason they'd want to block your projectiles from this angle. It was almost certainly meant to be an invisible wall of low collision instead. So whatever was happening around this walkway seems to have resulted in some errors with the high collisions. But things do get back on track just a little bit further into the level. In Phobia's video on glitches you can do in Dark Souls 2, he demonstrates how jumping along this railing can get you out of bounds. This is because they made this wall below with only the rocks in mind, not making it even taller for the nearby rooftop. Then, in addition to that, there's also some low collision down here that isn't also covered with a death plane. meaning you can run around underneath a decent chunk of the level. Anyways, while they didn't protect these railings or rooftop more than what you can see, a little further into the level, we do have another out-of-bounds rooftop that was blocked off. And while most of the railings in this part of the level match what we see, they did make the ones by the gazebo have this extra piece on top that'd cause you to slide off. And the staircase gets a taller invisible wall as well, as they obviously didn't want you jumping out of bounds to the rocks below. Similarly, the railings leading up to the Ancient Dragon were given the slip and slide treatment as well. Once you know it's here, it can be fun to mess with as it looks pretty silly. The Ancient Dragon's arena is also protected with enemy walls, but it has some pretty considerable gaps. The edge of the arena sticks out further from the landmass, and they didn't bother connecting it to an invisible floor. And over by the entrance, there's a pretty large gap here as well. But the Ancient Dragon's model is large enough to make these things a non-issue. No matter how hard I tried, even when taking control of him, I couldn't get him to fall to his death. His size also explains why the invisible wall is further out than the ground beneath us. Because he's so large, putting the walls right at the actual edge would mean that he wouldn't even be able to get that close to the edge in the first place. So putting them a bit further out just makes the space a little more reasonable for him. Okay, let's move on to the DLC and start with Shulva. I like this giant sconce over by the summoning pool, which has this large cone that prevents you from landing on top of it without immediately sliding off. Also noticed some columns that were made as objects, which as far as I can tell aren't breakable by any nearby enemies' attacks, so these are likely here once again to help the camera not get pushed around by their collisions. While it might seem obvious in hindsight to design pillars this way, we can find nearby examples of them not doing that. These ones aren't objects, and they do catch the camera, so it's interesting to see when and where they bother to do this. The see-through object pillars are closer to one of the mechanisms, so maybe they just realized that having your back to a pillar while trying to interact with it could be a little annoying if it caught the camera. Now, here's something we haven't run into yet. Over by the hidden mechanism that leads to the secret area with the horny tree guy, there's a small issue with the high collisions here. Remember that high collisions are what our attacks and projectiles interact with, but something I didn't explain at the start of the video is that this assumes that the high collisions for a given chunk of the level are even loaded in the first place. Unlike the low collisions, which are loaded for an entire level at once, the high collisions, with their higher polygon counts, are a more demanding thing for the game to handle. So they're not all loaded at once, they're only going to be loaded for the segment of level you're currently in, as well as adjacent spots. And when high collisions aren't loaded, the game only has the low collisions to go by, so it'll default to those for things like what your projectiles are going to impact. In Dark Souls 1, this led to an issue where you couldn't snipe the crow demons in this tower when you really should have been able to. Here in Dark Souls 2, the impact on gameplay is a lot more subtle, but it hits at something kind of interesting and obscure with the collisions here. When we first arrive, the high collisions across this gap aren't loaded yet, meaning it uses low collisions instead, and here's what that does. It creates an invisible overhang that protrudes further than it should, which blocks these statues more than they're supposed to be, making them a little bit harder to hit, especially with firebombs. But I noticed something interesting here. If I reload the area after the platform is raised, now the high collisions decide to load, making it easier to hit when it's pointless because the platform's already been raised. But why is it working differently now? I don't have the exact details ironed out, but in talking with others, it seems very likely that it has something to do with toggling this nearby nav mesh. Though this debug mod displays all of the nav meshes at all times, the one crossing the gap isn't activated until the platform is raised, so the enemy won't just try running across it until it is. Part of how the game decides to load nearby high collisions is probably handled by the game determining what's considered a nearby area via charting paths along the nav meshes, leading to a situation where the game gets a little confused here when the nav mesh isn't yet activated. Now, here's a few more of the typical invisible walls you'd probably expect. Anytime you see piles of rubble blocking off a path, you can assume it's completely covered up. We see the usual stalagmite protection as well, down by all these losers. And in Alana's boss room, the perimeter of the room is closed off as well. There is a funny spot in the Dragon's Rest Tower where a segment of wall wasn't properly covered with collisions. It might not be obvious visually, because of Z-fighting you can't always see all of the collisions where they overlap with the map's textures, when you wind up seeing bits of the map instead. but in this case the dark part we see is actually a hole in the wall. And while this railing normally blocks it, you can get to the other side of the railing from above, allowing you to get out of bounds. And one last quick look at Sin's boss room, but I remember back in the day feeling like this was a pretty huge arena. To some extent that is owed to the fake distant scenery, which is protected with pretty tall invisible walls. Looking at the actual size and shape of this arena now, with Elden Ring in mind, it suddenly doesn't feel so big. In Brume Tower, I'd like to start by taking a closer look at the giant chain bridge. While the high collision can pull your feet down tightly onto the chains and make it appear like you're walking along something kind of precarious, the actual shape of the bridge is perfectly flat, and it's fairly generous with its width. Across the bridge, we'll find walls with taller invisible walls extending above them, and this out of bounds area below is covered up with a tall wall as well. We also have these spots inside where various chests and objects strewn about the environment sometimes have extra flaps to keep you away from getting on top or in between them. By the upper floor bonfire, there's a spot with a fence here that reveals another issue with loading high collisions. The fence is pretty wide open, and so it looks like you should be able to shoot enemies through it, but you can't. A look at the high collisions shows that these bars didn't get any high collisions at all, so not only should you be able to shoot between the bars themselves shouldn't even be an obstacle. Low collisions prevent us from walking through, but our arrows shouldn't get stuck on low collisions, so what gives? Well, while they are passing through this first sheet of low collision, they're getting stuck on this other one on the opposite side of the fence. That's because the high collision of that room isn't loaded from here, meaning it has to default to using its low collision for projectiles, preventing us from firing through here. Maybe they were happy with this in the end? Perhaps they thought being able to shoot all of these enemies in advance would be too cheesy. The rest of the bars in this area are completely covered up, so they can't be fired through as well. But those all got proper sheets of high collision at least, and visually, the bars are closer to each other, making it a lot more obvious that you can't attack through them. So this spot up here just feels a bit weird. Outside, we have these enemies that float, and in the areas you encounter them, we find that they were given the same treatment as the Pursuer, with these invisible floors that stick out beyond the cliff's edges. Though I think this might be another case where they didn't do the cleanest job of making sure it only works for the specific enemy, because Maldron the Assassin can walk on top of them just fine, meaning you can't knock him to his death on this bridge. At first I thought it was maybe intentional for Maldron too, as perhaps they didn't want you to be able to cheese an NPC invader too easily. But then I also noticed that these crawling enemies and the barrel hollows are protected by these invisible enemy floors as well. It all looks like an oversight to me. Now let's take a look at a couple speedrunning tricks. You can jump down the interior of the tower and skip some of the level. It's not too surprising that this is possible, as elevators go up and down throughout the area, so it all needed to be open. They can't just stick death planes in here if you're supposed to be able to traverse this space. But what is surprising is the skip further down, known as the fume drop. We can see that this area is blanketed with a kill plane, so I was very confused as to how the player could avoid it. Passing through it should normally put the camera into the death cam angle, and our death should be guaranteed when we hit the ground regardless of distance after that happens. I was wondering how the player passed through the kill plane without anything happening, but I was just mistaken. The kill plane didn't extend all the way to the wall, leaving this gap here that players can fit through. But then there's also the question of how did the player survive the fall? Even without the kill plane, this should clearly be a guaranteed death because of how high the fall is, and I don't have an answer to this. I believe it has something to do with colliding with a sloped surface in such a way that it confuses fall damage and allows you to avoid it. There's a couple places in the game where this is used to survive impossible heights, and I'm not sure anyone knows why this works exactly, but if you do, please leave a comment below. Lastly, there's something funny we can see on the ground level near the Fume Knight boss room. The high collision reveals a different entrance to the set piece that no longer exists. Just like some of the removed boards and stuff we found earlier, once you know it's here, you can easily confirm its existence by trying to attack it. Despite being a lot larger and more present than stuff like those wooden boards, like, it's not floating up in the air somewhere, I figured this would be hard to notice as well due to the lack of enemies in the area. But then I remembered that a couple enemies do spawn down here once you use all the smelter wedges, so if anyone ever lured them back here, they might have had a real bad time with their weapon smacking into some invisible walls. And here we are at our final destination, Frozen Eleum Loyce. This courtyard has a few landmarks that appear to have open spaces, but are actually closed off. It includes this fountain, which they really didn't want you getting on top of for some reason. Now, for all of the steeper hills here, there's no invisible wall trickery. They wanted you to be able to go around and drop back down if you wanted, so it's all as open as it looks, and they just relied on the natural shape of the environment to restrict movement. The nearby rooftop with the 3 frozen chests has some railing extensions. These were put here to help prevent getting out of bounds. You'd be able to fall out of the map if you went this way. Of course, the open section of this rooftop isn't closed off, but I like how it includes an invisible ramp you can't normally see to help get you over that small bump. This walkway with the ballista on it also has taller railings as well, probably not only to help prevent getting out of bounds, but also so that you couldn't just walk along the railing to get past the frozen barrier. The barrier itself is an object file, and I think it's pretty neat seeing what looks like a conventional invisible wall as part of the object itself. It's not surprising that they did this. Its whole point is that it blocks this path, so it is what we would expect. But nonetheless, you don't find a lot of objects in these games that have what look like traditional invisible walls as part of them. Over here, we have this invisible ladder, which you can't normally see until the snow clears, but you can interact with it while it's invisible, and there's just something kind of fun seeing it in green here when we're not supposed to see it at all. Moving on, we have this return path that drops you off outside Ava's boss room. We can see that these nearby fences were made to be a lot taller, not wanting the player to try and drop into that area behind them. And Ava's got some invisible enemy walls to help protect them from falling out of the map. Down by the lower garrison bonfire, you have this broken staircase leading up to some unseen space above. But even if you could get onto the staircase, the visuals are a lie because the ceiling is closed off and you wouldn't be able to get up there. There's nothing up there anyways, but here's a quick look if you were curious. When you're in that outside lower area with the golems and sonics, invisible walls line the perimeter of the space. And the snow-covetous demon has what looks like a sort of throne space behind him. At least that's how I always thought of it, but you're not able to get into it. Now, for something completely out of left field, we have this distant out-of-bounds outcrop seen here. Not only does it have collision, but the low collision reveals what looks like tombstones. It's interesting to see how a more detailed and unique set piece was originally envisioned for this unused space. And that made me wonder, were we ever meant to be able to go up there? We don't have any clear answers, but I think it's likely. It's worth pointing out how in that cave area, we have that illusory wall that leads up to an item. The cave path behind that illusory wall starts off going up pretty close in that direction. Or better yet, there's this dead end in that same cave. If you could get on the other side of it, it would lead pretty much directly to this outcrop with the tombstones. And bearing in mind how you can see this area not far from the cave entrance, but before you can enter the cave, it would be a good way of teasing at a spot you can't get to right away. So this all seems very intentional and very likely that the cave was previously intended to lead up there. But while we're on top of that outcrop, we get perhaps our closest look at the scenery surrounding the level. With some very obvious 2D trees and simplistic geometry below, I can imagine that they felt more work would have had to go into making this vantage point not look terrible. Which seems like a pretty reasonable culprit as to why they might have given up on doing something with this space in the first place. But I do find myself wishing there was something here now. Something Moonlight Ruin brought to my attention is that beneath this tower with the Loyce Knight, the low collisions reveal a couple unused doorways, or windows maybe. It's not entirely clear what was going on here, but there would have been room to add lower floors, and it looks like they might have been considering that. The entrance to the Burnt Ivory King has these walls that stop us from going onto that platform, denying us from chilling with our friends in this pretty cool set piece. Though you can get back there using the moon jump glitch, since the invisible walls aren't very tall, and we do have the staircase to start from. Inside the boss room, when the Ivory King steps out from his portal thing, I was curious if he had an invisible floor underneath him. It turns out he doesn't. The animation just forces him to walk forward independent of gravity for a moment. Then once he's inside the arena, he is protected with invisible enemy walls that surround the space. As for the frigid outskirts, I don't really have anything to share. Maybe some portions of the outer wall are slightly taller or more severe than what you can see, but overall, I'd say that this area doesn't really have invisible walls. But it does have these platforms by the first building which lack low collision, preventing you from walking fully on top of them properly, while the high collision does match their shape correctly, raising your feet with inverse kinematics. So anytime you stand still on them, you can see how it messes up the player's pose, making it look like they're ready to squat and take a dump. Fitting as the only thing worth mentioning in the frigid outskirts. Well, that was quite a journey through Drangleic. I realized I skipped some areas. In addition to the Gutter and Black Gulch, I also didn't touch upon the Dark Chasm of Old. Not that I didn't take a look, I did make a couple notes while researching for this video, but I didn't find anything worth talking about. That being said, if there's anything I missed or anything you were wondering about, please leave a comment and let me know. I'm happy to take requests and respond with screenshots showing the collisions of anywhere in the game. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Lord Radai. I used his Debug Manager mod to visualize the collisions in-game, so this video simply wouldn't have been possible without the tools he's been making. He was also very on top of bug reports that I sent his way. Debug Manager has already been updated several times just in the process of me making this video, and that's cool as hell. I'd also like to thank the Dark Souls 2 speedrunning community, particularly Nubist, Stennis, and Jeff the Big Lizard for answering some questions I had and sharing their insight. There's a few things in this video I would have missed and not known about if it weren't for them. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Moonlight Ruin for the modding assistance and general feedback whenever I find something that makes me say, what the hell? If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing or doing any of the engagement things that help. It really makes a big difference. You can also support me directly on Patreon, that's patreon.com/illusorywall. An extra special thanks to all of my Patreon backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Aronar, Basileus, Europa, Gary Marshall, Incieratable, Jack Gerhardt, Kakuruma, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Matt, Ronax, the Majalis Duo, and Zelther. Thanks for watching and have a great day. I'm glad I can finally get running. You can probably hear the cold coming out in my voice. This last couple sections really sucked to record. Bye.